Hello, everyone. It's Dan Sandick here from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone who's joining, I think, from across the country. Looks like we have a pretty good crowd today. So we have Professor Slobodan Simonovic presenting today on some of his recent work on climate change and flooding in Canada. This should be a pretty interesting topic, I think, for everyone on the line. And as I mentioned, we should have a very good turnout and hopefully a good discussion following the presentation. So a brief introduction to Professor Simonovic. So first, Dr. Slobodan Simonovic is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Western University. And he's also, in fact, ICLR's chair of engineering studies. Professor Simonovic is known around the world for his interdisciplinary research and systems analysis. I think pretty well known in Canada and elsewhere for his work on flooding and climate change. He has over 500 professional publications, several major textbooks, and he is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineers, the Canadian Society of Civil Engineers, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the International Water Resources Association. So we're very happy that Professor Simonovic can make time to present his work to us today. And before we get started, for those of you who are new to our presentation format, we'll be collecting questions throughout Professor Simonovic's presentation, and then we'll hold a discussion at the end. If you could use the Q&A function that you should find on within the webinar software, you can enter your questions anytime throughout the presentation, and we'll have a discussion at the end. And just before we get started, a quick note that on June 14th, we'll have our next Friday Forum, and we'll have Environment Climate Change Canada in to talk about their recent Canada's Changing Climate Report, which you've probably heard about a fair bit in the news recently. So with that, again, we're very happy to have Professor Simonovic presenting, and I will pass it over to him.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you for the introduction. I am very happy to be today with you and share a little bit of the research that is being conducted with the support of the Chaucer Syndicates. This is a collaborative research grant by Chaucer Syndicates and ANSERC. This particular work that I'll be talking about today is only one of the 5 sub-projects or tasks under this particular project. The team that worked with me includes brother and sister Gaur. They both finished the work at university and are now both employed by the NRC, one in Ottawa and one in Edmonton. So the work that will be presented represents the really first Canada-wide assessment of future changes in flood hazard and risk. And this comprehensive assessment was done together with the uncertainty that's kind of associated with considering large ensembles of future projections. In this particular case, we were focusing on utilizing the future runoff projections and processing them in order to assess the flood risk as well as the flood hazard. The results of the analysis were pointing that northern provinces of Canada, southwestern Ontario, northeastern Quebec, and southern prairies are expected to face increase in frequency of flooding, whereas northern prairies, north central Ontario will kind of face the decrease in the frequency of flooding. Larger parts of Canada, I think, that follows this global warming trend is that larger parts of Canada will be expecting or experiencing earlier snowmelt than the snowmelt-driven flooding. Southern Ontario cities, we focused also on the impact of change of the flood frequency on 100 most populated cities and over 1,700 flow regulator stations. And the outcomes are that Southern Ontario cities are really associated with the highest increases in future flood risk. and many, over 60% of the flow regulatory regulating stations or locations are also facing significant increase in the potential flooding, therefore really requiring serious adaptation of the regulatory rules and their adaptation to changing conditions. I organized the presentation in the following way to kind of go quickly through the introduction. I suppose the topic is relatively close to most of the people who are on listening. I will review the research objectives so that it's very clear what the focus of this particular work was, walk you through the methodology, the data and models used in the process of analysis, and then present some of the results that led to the conclusions. The report that Dan mentioned, which will be the topic of the next Friday forum, is pointing out that observed climate in Canada is changing. On the left-hand side, you have an illustration of the change in the average temperature, and the northern western parts are obviously showing pretty dramatic increase. Most of the country is showing in the yellowish orangey color, showing the increase of up to 2 degrees. As a kind of follow-up of the change in temperature, the change of the precipitation is also occurring. The right-hand slide on the right-hand side is showing the kind of precipitation departure from the average. And as you can see, the kind of distributions across the country is pointing out the increase in the central parts, decrease in the northern eastern parts, and kind of various levels of increase in the rest of the country. So these are the observations. These are the kind of documented changes that are occurring in Canada. And the following is the presentation of the climate model predictions. And the climatologists are developing the models that are being used to look at the climate in the future and project the changes in temperature, precipitation, and other hydrometeorological variables. I selected only some of the illustrations. These particular models are utilizing different emission scenarios, which are nowadays called the representative concentration pathways, which are illustrating the level of severity of potential contribution to the change of the composition of the atmosphere and therefore the impact on the climate. The first three, or the three graphs on the top, are showing the temperature change for the three different emission scenarios for the period 2081 2100, and these particular projections are the products of the Canadian climate model. And as you can see, the darker red is obviously indicating, higher level of warming, but the clear message is that the whole country is subject to pretty significant warming, which will be increasing in time. The bottom three graphs are showing the model predictions of the precipitation change. And again, we are seeing a relatively similar kind of picture where the increase is covering almost the whole country at a different level. Under the most severe scenario, the two graphs on the right-hand side, you can see that very large portion of the country will be subject to very high increase in temperature and pretty significant change in the precipitation. So flood modeling in general represents our ways of understanding the flow on floodplains, which is controlled by topography, friction, or the different land use. They're very complex patterns of kind of water depth and velocity, and various levels of modeling tools sophistication levels of modeling tools are being used to kind of capture these patterns and help us potentially understand better the impacts of the floods, as well as predict the future flooding conditions. Two-dimensional models in space and dynamic in time are probably top of the line in modeling tools that are being utilized for that. Nowadays, earlier, the kind of larger scale modeling was limited by the available data and especially computational power available. Nowadays, the situation is changing, and various tools, as you will see here, modeling tools are providing input that can help us perform this kind of flood modeling and flood analysis over the larger spatial scales or regions. Obviously, the larger scale you go, the more simplified kind of hydraulic models are being used in order to find the best balance or trade-off between the computational time and the accuracy of the computation. This particular part of the study that I mentioned at the beginning had a number of objectives. The first objective was to investigate changes in the frequency and magnitude of 100-year and 250-year return period flood events across Canada. The reason we selected these two return periods is that most of the regulatory rules across the country, which are in the hands of different provinces, are utilizing one of these two or maybe both of them in delineating the floodplains and also analyzing the impacts of floods, potential floods on the population living in these areas. We also investigated changes in timing of the peak flood events or peak flows across country, assessed the future flood risk for 100 most populated Canadian cities and 1,700 flow regulation infrastructure. Because the particular type of analysis is utilizing the global climate models, and one particular output that's nowadays available, the runoff, we wanted to also provide some assessment of the uncertainty together with the results of the flood frequency change. So the final objective was to do this uncertainty analysis, which is introduced by utilization of multiple climate models and emission scenarios in deriving the future projections. Methodology, in short, is presented on this particular slide. The starting point are the low resolution future runoff projections that are coming from the global climate models. They do have a low spatial resolution, 2 to 5 degrees, and they're utilizing the kind of energy balance and land surface schemes in generating the runoff. The runoff as a product or as the output of the GCMs or global climate models is relatively new. The models in this particular area are being improved on kind of daily basis. The quality of the representation of various processes vary. And in this particular research, we wanted to see how the runoff can be utilized and how that type of information can help us generate some of the potential conclusions on the larger spatial scales, like the whole Canada or the larger regions. These low resolution future runoff projections are then processed with the macro scale hydrodynamic model. We utilize the University of Tokyo Kama flood model. I forgot to mention at the beginning that beside our Canadian team, we collaborated very closely with Dr. Yamazaki from the University of Tokyo, who is the author of the model and did help us set the model and perform some calculations. Some calculations are performed together. So this hydrodynamic model is utilized to kind of downscale the low resolution runoff projections into the high resolution flows on the 10 to 25 kilometer resolution. And that required pretty significant computational power, and that power was provided through the high computational network available to most of the Canadian universities, including Western. I'll say a few things about that a little bit later. From this high resolution flow projection, the relatively traditional statistical analysis is performed to arrive at the kind of flood risk change in the both flood hazard first, and then processed and combined to come up with a change in the flood risk. The flood model that was performing this kind of downscaling of the runoff information into information on the smaller scale, 25 kilometer kind of grid scale, is the type of macro scale model that is capturing the global hydrodynamic processes. It is a grid-based model that covers the river and floodplain routing, utilizing as input the runoff forcing that comes from the global climate models, and then performing the calculation of flow in each grid cell, which is called in the model specific unit catchment, producing as output the water storage. The method for the calculation is called the flow, that's incorporated in the model is called the flow method. It starts with the upscaled river network map and then subgrid characteristics that are required for model in order to arrive at the flow calculations, channel length, altitude, distance to downstream, unit catchment areas, elevations, and so on. River network map is kind of prepared, tracing the fine resolution flow direction map, and that represents the kind of input into the model. We did in the process of starting the research compared 4 of these types of models. Flood was selected at the end, and in the comparison, we utilize something like what you see on the right-hand side at the bottom. Basically, the model generated flows compared to the observed flows are in Canadian HIDAT database. As you can see, the kind of correlation between these two, which is measured through the kind of intensity of the red dots, is pretty high across the country. And that was one of the reasons that this particular model was selected. And the other reason was the first availability of the model and also willingness of the authors to collaborate and provide assistance if needed. In order to do this kind of analysis, we utilized very large number of databases. The first one, obviously, was the daily historical and future GCM runoff data. That's the basic kind of input into the process. That runoff was generated for the historical period from 1961 to 2005, and future period from 2061 to 2100. We also utilize the historical reanalysis flow data, the Northern America reanalysis outputs for the period 1993-2007 data, together with the historical river discharge data from the HIDAT database, were utilized in testing and calibrating basically the model. In order to kind of convert the flood hazard into flood risk, we utilized very limited information and decided to go ahead with the basically population exposed to potentially flooding conditions. And the population for these 100 most largest cities in Canada was obtained from the Stats Canada database for the year 2015. So you can see very large amount of data that was required in order to perform the analysis. this is what we have done. We performed the continuous daily simulations for historical period and future flow projections across the country. We used as input daily flow data from 21 global climate models, taking all available emission scenarios, RCPs. That ended up in 84 future data sets and 21 historical data sets. A very large number of runs was required to actually process all the information. Change in the 100 and 250 year return period flood magnitude were kind of estimated, and flood frequency analysis utilized the GEV distribution, or generalized extreme value distribution, with the parameters, the three parameters of the distribution were estimated using the method of moments. In hydrology, relatively known kind of procedure, statistical procedure. This is really the kind of key challenge, and the challenge was to, perform the flow and flood inundation calculations that included 1 million kind of spatial grids across Canada and over 3 million days of kind of simulation. So this is where the basically SharkNet, or the high computation power, was required. Supercomputers were required. The rest of this slide I cannot even read, and please do not ask questions about it. This particular analysis was done by my research team and assistance of the SharkNet personnel at University of Western Ontario. The point was that obviously calculation required number of days of the supercomputing time, and generated a very large amount of output data. So that was not possible to be stored in the high computational network, because that slows down the use of the network by other users. And we were kind of downloading this information onto local machines to do the post-processing, the statistical analysis, and then graphical presentation of the change in the frequency, as well as the calculation of the flood risk. And here is one of the types of kind of outputs that generated. What you see on the screen is the output from the single model, this particular model, and 4 different RCP or emission scenarios. The change in color is showing actually the change of the 100-year return period frequency to the frequency indicated in color. The bluish cells are the cells where the flooding frequency is majorly increasing from 100 years to, as you can see, 20, 30 years. And the darker red or brownish color are the cells or the regions that are showing the decrease in frequency. This is obviously very hard to see on the map of the scale, but many blue dots in these areas where we have a very high population in Canada are, I think, of major concern. This is just to show you as the kind of type of result that was generated by the analysis. And we utilized all these 21 different models and all these 4 emission scenarios, and then integrated or aggregated the results through the so-called median approach. This is a large ensemble, and this particular first analysis with all the models, all emission scenarios aggregated into median. We're also not paying too much attention what is the agreement or disagreement between different models. But to actually do a little bit more detailed analysis, we were looking into outputs of each of these selected 21 models, and then created a second set of outputs or analysis that I call the second approach, which is referred as a robust median approach, where the sign of change projected by different global climate models are analyzed, and projections for which more than 50% of the GCMs concur on the sign of change are used to get aggregated estimates. So we had estimates based on all the models, all the scenarios, and the estimates based on this kind of robust estimates based on the models and emission scenarios that are showing the agreement in the sign of change. This is the outcome of the aggregated median results for a 100-year return period. You see the 100-year and the different blocks are showing the different emission scenarios. Again, the change, the blue color is the indication of the increase in frequency, and the darker green and brown decrease in frequency. The regions which are subject to increase and decrease are slowly becoming very clear when you look at this type of information. I also mentioned that, so this is by using all 21 models and all emission scenarios. The picture changes a little bit when you use the robust median result. So these 4 graphs are showing the kind of same output, but now output that's basically averaging only the models that agree in the sign of change. And again, we have a blue and brown showing the increase and decrease in frequency, but the distribution is a little bit different. The white dots or the white cells are now the cells where we didn't have actually agreement between different climate models, and that is one of the kind of pieces of information that needs to be taken into consideration when the final results of the studies like this are being taken for future use. The uncertainty I already mentioned was also assessed, and we assessed the uncertainty using this particular metric that you can see on the screen. This particular metric is showing the basically quantiles or the quantification of the uncertainty magnitude in the predictions of the models, where U represents or denotes the calculated uncertainty magnitude, and RPs are basically the projections of the runoff for different quantiles, 25, 75, and 50. So the graphs are indicating the pretty high level of uncertainty exists in many regions across the country. And the reason for that is the variety of the outcomes that the models, various climate models, are generating for different scenarios. So taking the picture, taking the message that flood frequency is increasing or decreasing at a particular location, I think needs to take into consideration also the information about the uncertainty which is available for the same location. Here are the results of the second type of analysis that we did, basically timing of the high flows or flooding. Regions in Ontario and Quebec are showing earlier summertime extreme flows, basically shift from April, May to March. You can see that as a change of the color, where in each graph you have a historical and under one emission scenario, the presentation of the basically month of the high or the peak flows. So you can nicely see actually this shift in space from the darker blue to lighter blue from April to March in the areas of Ontario, Quebec. If you look at the Nunavut, Yukon territories or the north, there is obviously indication of earlier summertime extreme flows from May to April. May is a kind of light green, and April the darker color, shown by the darker color. Also the it's important to point out that these gray grids, or the gray color, the grids are showing cases where more than 50% of the GCMs did not agree on the month of extreme flow in either historical or future timelines. And therefore, we didn't put any color on that. Basically, information was not available from. This graph actually contains a lot of information because different colors are showing different months and in different locations. You can actually see this. In this one, I just extracted the cells that are showing actually the change of the high flows, timing of the flood, high flow. So all these blue dots are the locations where the models and the analysis in this particular case of the robust median and 100-year return period for all 4 emission scenarios are predicting the timing, earlier appearance of the maximum flow up to 2 months. So you can see the very large portion of the Canadian territory, obviously due to the warming, will be facing this earlier high flows. The last piece of analysis included analysis of risk on the population across the country, as well as the flow regulating infrastructure. The red dots in the map are indicating location of 100 most populated cities across the country, and the blue crosses are locations of the flow regulation infrastructure. Flow regulation infrastructure includes from kind of reservoirs to intakes to other type of infrastructure that's used to regulate the flow across the country. The flood hazard is kind of calculated using or normalized using this particular relationship, where this is the projection of the flow normalized with the difference between the maximum and minimum runoff, and represented in the graph by the triangles pointing in the upper direction in the red color are actually the locations of the cities that are subject to higher flood hazard, where the hazard is again scaled by color from increase to decrease. The blue dots are showing the locations where the hazard is being reduced. Again, this is the presentation for one particular emission scenarios. We have this type of information for all scenarios, all data, aggregated median and the robust median approach. When you add the population, the P in the bottom, the relationship is actually the population of the urban areas, which is utilized together with the flood hazard to come up with the flood risk. The picture is changing a little bit. As you can see, the color of the triangles is becoming less red, or because obviously population is affecting the level of risk because it's multiplied by the hazard. But the distribution seems to be relatively similar, following basically the hazard change. I took out some of the results for the particular locations just to show you how this type of analysis can be used, beside of getting a very clear picture for the very large region and understanding what are the kind of regional differences. Each of these 25 by 25 kilometer cell contains all the information that can be extracted. If you identify the location of the city, you can extract, and as you can see, the results are pointing in certain direction for Toronto, Montreal, Hamilton, Kitchener. We have these bluish color numbers which are pointing out in the major increase in frequency of flooding. I selected also the pictures of the recent, 2017 flood in Montreal, the Pierrefonds district, and the same district, not even months, 3 weeks ago. Kind of indication what is already happening, what we are seeing, that the frequency of these high flows and the frequency of flooding is on increase. It is important to point out that not all the scenarios are generating kind of expected results, and that is caused by the fact that these different models didn't have all the scenario out. The climate models did not have all the results for this. I am now talking, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go back because I think somehow I skipped one slide to show you all the models that we utilized. Here is the slide. It is a very small font, but just for your information, on the left-hand side, you see the 21 global climate models from all the climate modeling centers around the world. Norwegian from Europe, North America, South America, Asia, China, Japan, Australia, and so on. And in the last 4 columns, you see actually the available runoff information for different emission scenarios. You realize not all the models were providing the runoff information for all emission scenarios. And the RCP6 was, in my opinion, the most kind of deficient emission scenarios. According to IPCC, many models are actually not performing the calculations for this particular scenario anymore. And in most of the literature, the scenario is being kind of interpolated with the results from the 4.5 and 8.5 emission RCP. So that the fact and the availability of this input information was reflected in the final results. I am pointing that out just because we are seeing that RCP6 is showing decrease and increase for 100 and 250, and the reason for that is simply not available, not sufficient information that's available from the enough information available from the global climate models. When we process all 100 models, we did the calculation, and depending on the kind of scenario, between 40 and 60% of the Canadian 100 most populated cities are high at risk of increased flooding under the changing climatic conditions. And that's I think the summary figure that is having a pretty serious, or should have a pretty serious impact on our decision making, government governing and deciding how to deal with the hazards and approve development in these regions which may be affected by the floods. Similar analysis was performed, as I pointed out, for these flow regulation infrastructure locations. And the reason we went into this analysis is that it's already being noted that many of the storage facilities, for example, across Canada, are not serving anymore the purpose they are designed for. Then many of other infrastructure is being subject to pretty high level of pressure to deliver the services that's designed for. And this analysis is pointing out for the infrastructure that may be affected by high flows. We have a 45 to 60% expecting to experience increase in flood magnitudes. And that doesn't mean anything else than the major need to really revise or look into the base, how we are using this infrastructure, how is this infrastructure operated, and try to adjust these operating rules to kind of changing conditions. The same analysis was done in the change of frequency, which is shown by the graphs like this one, the darker blue, more frequent, brown, more less frequent, and also the timing. The different colored dots are showing the kind of time changing in the timing of the flood peaks. So this is in a relatively brief presentation. These are the results of the first Canada-wide assessment of the future changes in flood hazards and risk, together with the assessment of the uncertainty from using the large ensemble of future runoff projections. The results pointing particular locations that are that should be pretty seriously analyzed: northern provinces of Canada, southwestern Ontario, northern Quebec, southern prairies. This kind of increase in frequency, and the northern prairies, north central, with a decrease. Larger parts of Canada expected to face the earlier than usual snowmelt-driven floods, or basically appearance of the peak flows earlier, usually a month or 2 months earlier. Southern Ontario cities definitely being at the highest potential increase in future flood risk, and approximately 50% of the flow regulating locations subject to more frequent high flows or flooding that needs to be subject to potentially revision of the regulatory rules and use of other adaptation options. For those of you who may be interested in details of the study, we have a number of publications. The work was very highly regarded by the 2 feature papers in the Water Journal, the special issue on extreme floods and droughts under the future climate scenarios. And also we have a very detailed so-called the Blue Book report that my laboratory is providing. These are available for download for free. And this particular, the first reference on top, is providing very detailed information on the use of this particular model for the type of analysis that we have done. Basically like almost a user manual for someone who may be interested to either expand or replicate the studies that we have done. If you are interested to get the copies of these papers, they are all available for download, but I can also send the PDFs to anyone who sends me an email. You can reach me at slobodansimonovic.com. And with this, I would thank you for your attention, and we'll be very happy to answer some questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Simonovic. I especially like that this work was done with the brother and sister team, and now they're both working for National Research Council. So if you wouldn't mind going back to slide 23, there are a couple of questions from our online participants. Sorry, yeah, there we go. So first, Jeff, actually Jeff and Dane, we had 2 questions from our participants asking for, maybe walk us through several of those cells and explain exactly what's happening.
Yeah. Well, okay, so what the numbers are basically showing, the blue cells are indication of the increase in frequency of flooding. So 100-year flood for Toronto under this particular emission scenario is expected to reach the frequency of 22 years, 237 years, and so on. For the regions that are subject to decrease, you see that 100-year is expected to be that the reddish cells are indicating the reduction in frequency. I would like to point out that the analysis that we have done, because it's done on a regional scale, on the scale of the country, and you have seen that this started with the GCM runoff values on a very coarse spatial scale that's downloaded through this hydrodynamic model should be used with a grain of salt at the particular location. I think the direction of change, the change of frequency, is definitely captured because all the models that I'm showing here, the robust median, that means all the models with the 50% of more than 50% agreement in the direction of change are here. And that can be, I think, that can be taken very clearly. However, is this 22 or 28 years may not be very, I would say, may not be or should be taken with the value of uncertainty that I presented in other graphs for the same location. The uncertainty is being introduced through the kind of availability of the global climate model, emission scenarios that are going into this ensemble. And obviously, if some information is missing or some scenarios are not fully captured with the available input data, the accuracy or the uncertainty in these numbers is higher. And that was shown in this graph between the kind of green colors and red colors where the uncertainty results were presented.
Okay, just on that uncertainty question, could you give maybe an indication here, say for that RCP 2.6, the 100-year return period becoming 22 in Toronto, roughly what would you say the uncertainty is there?
Okay, I didn't. That's a very good question. I should have done that. I don't have that information. That information will be in this particular graph. If we locate the cell, the Toronto cell, and that will be the measure of uncertainty. Sorry, I don't have that extracted. All the information is available. I mean, we have this on the computer disks and for each cell across the country.
Okay, that's good. So we'll have access to that information
no problem.
Right. Okay. So a question about risk. So you mentioned in specifically Southern Ontario, there'll be increasing risk, and in these studies, you were considering population as the sort of risk factor. One question is, are you looking at population only in the flood-prone areas or across the entire urban area?
No. This is the total population. The P in this particular relationship here, where we were calculating the risk for the city, is the population for the city. So I do realize that not the whole population is subject to that, but the kind of resolution of this type of analysis is not allowing us to actually enter the information on the finer scale. That, to me, would be the kind of follow-up of the analysis like this. If you identify the locations of, kind of critical, higher increase in hazard and potentially risk, doing a much more detailed analysis for the either watershed in question or the city with the number of watersheds that may be subject to. No, this is all the global information.
Right. And follow up on that question then. So for the future scenarios, was there a projection period or future date that was being considered there?
Yes. The projections of the change in the population is utilized. Yeah.
Okay, so it's both accounting
for. You do realize that this is a very, very rough representation of the risk. I mean, if you're just basically scaling the hazard with the population in the city, I mean, that's what this is doing.
Right. And is there a plan for follow-up studies to look at other risk factors, say, development, concentration of buildings?
We already have done studies like that. We have done 2 studies earlier, my research group. One was done for the Grand River watershed, and another one for the Thames, and with special, obviously, emphasis on London. And in these two studies, we went into very detailed kind of analysis of risk. For the London study, we looked into 17 different types of infrastructure, and only the infrastructure in the floodplains that's subject to flooding. And then we used the future projections of the climate change projections and the impact on the change of flooding, and therefore the kind of risk. Again, when you're looking this kind of longer term, or you're trying to assess the risk on the longer term basis, the change in infrastructure, the change in population, and so on, they all are basically predicted values. So the risk can be done with this kind of future predictions of the changing conditions or vulnerabilities, or you can utilize the current state of vulnerability and subject to changing future physical conditions or flooding conditions.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Catherine. Could you please discuss a little bit about how snowmelt is incorporated into the projections?
Okay, I am not able to give you a lot of details on that, but all these models, the 21 global climate models that we use are very, very new in the sense of the kind of their structure. And they, as former Professor Suris from University of Waterloo, like to comment, the climatologists discovered hydrology, and what the reason why we were able to get the runoff projections is that now the climate models include actually much more detailed representation of the hydrology and hydrological processes. These are still very, very rough representations. For example, runoff formation is a very complex process with tons of physical parameters that are affecting it. And what we have done for all these 21 models, we were sure that they do include in the hydrologic parts the snowmelt. And that's all what I can say. But each model is actually modeling these processes in various ways. Snowmelt is usually modeled in a relatively simple degree day type of kind of calculation. But I cannot tell you exactly what, for example, NEROC is using for the snowmelt, or what the ESM is using. These models are very complex models. These climate models have 150,000 differential equations, but their manuals are providing this information. So all what was important for us was that we select the models first that are providing the runoff projection, and also to be sure that the runoff, all the kind of potential sources of runoff are being modeled.
Okay, great. So a question about the change in seasonality. So you mentioned that in many parts of the country, we'll expect peak flows to occur earlier in the year.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the implications of those scenarios in terms of risk in managing what happens?
That also that also kind of depends. In many cases, the earlier high flows maybe, or earlier melt may give us more time and may not result in the kind of peak magnitudes that are being faced right now. However, there is I think combined impact of temperature and the precipitation. The temperature is affecting this kind of distribution of the timing of the peak flows. However, if the temperature is followed with the change, or increase in temperature is followed with the increase in the precipitation, we may have this kind of combination of the conditions which are very common in Canada, like the Montreal and Ontario floods this particular season, are these rain on snow type of events where the intensive precipitation is occurring during the periods of the melt, and altogether this creates the kind of higher flooding conditions or higher flows. So if you look at only timing, the temperature, I think it may have some positive impacts. But if that is kind of combined with the change in the precipitation, increase in the precipitation, then I think we may see the more kind of more frequent floods and more higher or larger magnitude floods.
Okay, great. Another question from Jeff. If you could go back to slide 23. So Jeff is asking, and I guess this is all taken in the context of uncertainty of those values, but is there any reason why under RCP 8.5 in Edmonton, the 250-year flood might be increasing in frequency, whereas all other types are decreasing?
You see, this is I think this is only the indication of the kind of complexity of the runoff process that comes. You see, the normal and expected change will be that with the more severe RCP or emission scenarios, that the change will be in one direction. But for a number of locations, we did face and did see this type of information, and I think that's only being driven by the input that we used from the global climate models and their ability to model the runoff with a high level of accuracy. There is no explanation. I mean, this is why I was pointing out that this table, and we did look at the 100 locations and 1,000 or 1,100 other locations. We have seen this type of behavior, which is directly driven by the input or the output of the global climate models, which are the input into this analysis of flood frequency change.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you. So there are some questions here about sustainable solutions for increasing flooding.
Sorry, then something happened when you said sustainable what?
Oh, sorry. So there's a question here from Utan, said, what are the sustainable solutions for these, for increasing frequency of flooding? So maybe a couple thoughts on that.
Sustainable solutions for decreasing the impact?
For decreasing the impacts of increasing frequency, increasing flood risk. I'm not completely sure that we can affect very much this kind of change in the physical processes. Obviously, all the efforts in mitigating the changing climate that our government and international community is trying to implement are going into direction to control at least this change. Or what I think this type of studies can help us is to look at how to adapt to the changing conditions. So first is to use this as a kind of assessment of the potential hazard, and then when the hazard level is identified, to go into the risk and then go into the set of solutions. Recent flooding brought tremendous interest of, media and everything else. I think I was interviewed about, 12, 13 times, and very often the same question, what can we do? I think each location in Canada, there is no silver bullet. Second is that each location requires particular combination of the mitigation and adaptation options. And one message is relatively clear. We have to get out of the floodplains. I mean, in Europe, the people are providing space for rivers. They're getting rid of the old part of the cities, of dikes and everything else. We are continuing in Canada to develop in the floodplains. That is, to me, the first kind of obvious measure, but obviously subject to many conflicting interests of various levels of governments, like municipal, that's getting the taxes from the development, to, federal, that's maybe paying the bill for some of the damage. Right, right. Okay, very good. So you made a quick comment. I'm not sure if I caught it quite right, but I'll just run a question past you anyway. So your project included not just looking at cities, but also looking at flow regulation infrastructure. You mentioned 1,700 specific locations. And you mentioned that much of the infrastructure is not being used for its initial purpose. Did I catch that right?
No, not being used, not being able. What we are seeing is that currently infrastructure is not able to provide the level of service it's designed for. You know, we designed the drainage system to provide the protection from, you know, the events of the particular return period, a particular magnitude. What is being seen and reported with, you know, the flooding that's been happening recently is that this infrastructure is failing. And I think our analysis is pointing out, you know, maybe this is why it's failing, because the load that's coming from the kind of climate and changing climatic conditions is overloading this infrastructure. So I think the first step will be for the infrastructure that is being kind of operated, to revise the operational rules and try to adapt these rules to, you know, changing conditions and utilize the existing volume capacity to the maximum. And the second one is to actually think about the future infrastructure in a different way. How are we going to design? Should we consider changing the design criteria and standards in order to accommodate that change? So if you have a 60% of the you know, infrastructure across the country being subject to this, you know, more frequent flooding, it's very clear that the impact, you know, the impact and the significance of adaptation of the infrastructure is of primary concern.
Right. Okay. And actually, an additional question on that topic. So you mentioned that you might be able to change the operation for some of this infrastructure to manage changing conditions. Can you provide a little more information on how?
For example, if you have, I mean, some of these flow regulating infrastructure includes reservoirs. Reservoirs actually provide the storage for water. During the flooding, the reservoir storage is being used to actually store a portion of the flood hydrograph and reduce or control the flow downstream from the reservoir. How you provide that storage is being driven by the reservoir operating rules. Before the spring flooding, we usually empty the storage in order to provide the space, you know, for the incoming higher flows. So if, you know, our study is showing that, you know, this is going to happen now 1 or 2 months earlier, obviously the existing operating rules should take that into consideration. And that's what, you know, I'm saying, where we have opportunity to adjust or change the operating rules in order to improve the operation of the infrastructure under the changing conditions, that should be done first. And then, you know, look what can be done to actually bring the infrastructure to the level of service it's designed for, or where the needs are for the future expansion, investment, and you know, increase in the capacity.
Okay, thank you. And a question from Angela, who's on the line here. I think you may have answered this question. The flow data from the GCMs and so on is relatively new, and this is a course assessment. But the question is, since we're on the topic of reservoirs and so on, was the impact of large dams considered in the analysis?
Yes. Yeah. This is all the basic, not only the large dams, all the kind of regulating infrastructure is being. This is the reason why we also you know, made very relatively easy for us to look at the change of the frequency and risk at these locations, because we needed this in the input into the climate models, into the hydrodynamic models for the calculation of the flows. So yes, the existing infrastructure and the way how the infrastructure is operated is part of that input. I think I mentioned on one of the early slides when I was talking about the camouflage model.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. So, question from Jackie, and I think this was in reference to slide 11. Jackie was asking for the flow calculation grids. What is the size of the grid?
25 by 25 kilometer.
25 by 25. Okay.
Yeah. That's,
okay, very good.
Yeah, this is called the macro scale. But you see, we are starting with the runoff information that's provided by the global models on the scale of approximately 250 kilometers per 250. And then through this hydrodynamic calculation, we are downscaling to 25. And all the results are now based on the information on that particular spatial scale.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So one final question, and this is about the robust median method that was applied. Just to make sure we're clear on what was happening here. So you had some maps there where you had white cells where there was disagreement in the sign of change, in the direction of change. That's my understanding. And so you, using your approach, you focused on outputs where 50% or more of the models agreed on the sign of change. In those scenarios, were the remainder of the models with a different sign of change, were they removed from the assessment, or are they still considered? Just a little more information on the method.
Yeah, they were okay. So this is the output of the kind of robust median approach, and this previous one is just the aggregated median. So aggregated median approach is using the outputs from all 21 models for all emission scenarios. Okay, all the outputs are considered together, the median value calculated for each location and represented in this particular graph in this form. In the robust median approach, we now looked at the results. So for all these 21 models and all the emission scenarios, and we were selecting or creating ensemble only from the models where we have an agreement of 50% in the sign of change. So if the models didn't show or didn't belong to this group, they were eliminated. So the median calculated in this graph that you are now seeing is based on a smaller number of models, but the models that are showing the better agreement in the future change, direction of the future change.
Right. Okay. That's clear. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So I think we'll end it there. It was a very, very informative, interesting presentation, and there are lots of materials to follow up on. And so hopefully all of our participants, we had very good turnout today. I think we had a maximum of about 80 people on the line. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks very much again, Professor Simonovic, for the work and the great presentation. And just before we sign off, any last thoughts, Dr. Simonovic?
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. Yeah, I would like to say that this is really the first study done across for the Canada region. I would like this work to potentially continue. The climate models are changing. The new improved modeling is being done, and I think that will be increasing the accuracy of the analysis like this. Through this work, we developed the methodology. We developed the kind of process that can be kind of replicated with the newly generated inputs coming from the climate community. And I will be very happy to kind of continue the work in the same direction.
Okay, great. I'm sure we'll have you back in the future for more, more of these findings. So thank you again, Dr. Okay, thank you, Dr. Simonovic, and thanks for the attendees. And just a quick reminder that in just 2 weeks, and on June 14th, we'll have Environment Canada and Climate Change on our line here to discuss the recent Climate Change in Canada report. So hopefully you'll be able to join for that. So once again, thank you for joining, and thank you for the questions. And with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you.